we're going to continue speaking about kosher today. And then we're going to talk about tithing. Tithing. Right? So some people wear tithes. Joking. Tithing. Giving a tithe. Sorry. I'm here all week. Okay. So let's start with kosher though. So I explained yesterday how things that grow from the ground are kosher. No problem. The only problem theoretically could be is if someone did something to it and altered its natural state. So if you use a knife that's not kosher to cut fruit, and now you have cut fruit in your supermarket, you have on your supermarket shelves cut mango, cut watermelon, cut whatever it is. So now the question is, yeah, watermelon's kosher, but that's if it's whole. But who cut it? And how did they cut it? And what was the knife used before that? Now, you could say, no, the knife was clean, 100% clean, only used for fruit. Who says? Who are you trusting? Now, by the way, this is not conspiracy. I'm not like, do you know where your fruit has been? That's not, I'm just saying when it comes to kosher, right? When it comes to, although I am, no. When it comes to kosher, we have to be careful. So we want to ascertain, we want to be sure that what we're eating is legit, and it starts off legit, and it remained legit, and nothing else interrupted. That's why processed foods, all processed foods, need a hechsher, need some sort of certification that the processing was done in a kosher fashion. Even if it starts off 100% kosher, and you look at what could go wrong? What could go wrong? A lot of things could go wrong. So that's why it has to be certified. I have a brother-in-law who lives in California, who is a higher level individual in one of the kosher, the American kosher certifying agencies, and you should only know what happens behind closed doors. Sometimes, left to companies' own devices and employees' own devices, who knows what could happen? It's whatever. So. Therefore, what's required is certification. But again, if you're buying a whole watermelon, knock yourself out. I mean, don't, but you can buy the watermelon. It's not a problem. You're buying grapes, you're buying cherries, you're buying mango, potatoes, sweet potatoes, onions. No problem. No certification. It's good to go. But if it's cut or processed, then you have a question. What else did that touch? What else was involved in that process? When it comes to animals, living creatures, whether they're land animals, fish or birds, then you have criteria what's kosher, what's not. So yesterday we explained 3 categories: animals, fish, and birds. And we gave signs, kosher signs, for all of them. So let's talk about the signs. The signs of a kosher land animal are having split hooves and chewing its cud. So if the animal has both qualities, it chews its cud and has split hooves, then it's kosher. And so Stan asked me after the class, he said, is there significance to the whole split hooves, chew cud thing? Or is it random? Like, what's the deal with that? And it's not random. It's very specific. So first of all, we have to know this. This is how we begin kosher, and all discussions of kosher, they all have to begin in the same place. And that is, ultimately, God said. Ultimately, the Torah says. And that's what it's about. So any rationale that we ascribe is somewhat of a, working backwards. Once we have the laws of kashrut, once we have the laws of kosher, so now we're going to work backwards and figure out what's the meaning, what's the symbolism, what's the inspiration, etc. But even if we never figured anything out, or even if we figured out the greatest ideas, the reality is it's still what God wants, and that's why it's done. So that's the opening disclaimer. Now that that's out of the way, let's jump in and talk about some meanings behind the kosher symbols. So let's talk about split hooves. Split hooves, right? Maybe pull up a picture, or you pull up a picture for yourself. Split hooves, basically the foot or the hoof of the animal is split. There's a right side and there's a left side. So, but let me add one more piece of introduction before I jump in and explain what that means. Because we know as human beings, we know now, or any living creature, you are what you eat. And so what you and I eat becomes part of our biology, becomes part of our reality, becomes part of our flesh and blood. And therefore, Kosher is about making sure that whatever is introduced into our system is healthy, both physically healthy. As we said yesterday, an unhealthy animal is not kosher, even if it's a kosher type of animal. And even if it was slaughtered properly, if the animal had a mortal condition, a fatal condition, for example, let's say the lung had a puncture, and then it was kind of healed over, but you could see, based on the lung, that there's what's called a sircha, there's some sort of adhesion, where there's like a scabbing over that puncture, right? The body healed itself, but the idea is that it's still like a weak. It's not as strong, it's not as healthy as it once was. That's not called glatt kosher. You ever hear the word glatt kosher? Glatt kosher means, when it comes to animals, glatt means that it's smooth. The lungs are smooth without any adhesions to it, because that's a sign of lack of healthiness. So we are what we eat. Kosher means physically healthy, emotionally healthy, psychologically healthy, and spiritually healthy food. So it's food that's healthy on all levels. So now let's talk about some of the spiritual, psychological, or emotional features of the two kosher signs and understand why these animals are indeed fit to eat. So what about the split hoof? There's a right side, there's a left side. And what that means is like this. In life, we each have our personal direction. When I say direction, what I mean is you and I each have our own personal style. We have our personalities. Some of us are right side oriented, some of us are left side oriented. And in Kabbalah, what that means is some of us trend toward chesed, which is like an outgoing, effervescent, generous, open personality. And some of us trend toward the gvur, the left side personality, which is more exacting and more disciplinarian and more rules and strict and that sort of thing. And we all have both elements, but who's perfectly balanced? Whose needle is right in the middle? It's hard to find that sometimes. We're either usually a little bit more this side or a little bit more that side. And so the beauty, the power of the meaning, the symbolism, one of the symbolisms, there are many. One of the symbolisms of the split hoof is that it has a right side and a left side. And the meaning is to be a kosher human being. You ready? The animal is teaching us what it means to be a kosher animal, because we are what we eat, teaches us what it means to be a kosher human being. So what it means to be a kosher human being is not only do you have the right or the left, but you have both. You're able to challenge yourself, rise to the occasion, and lean on another power, another gift, another trait that maybe is not your favorite, maybe it's not your strength, but you're able to use it when you need it. Which means, I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say you're more of the chesed personality. Chesed could lead to everything goes. Could lead to, that's not its definition, but it could lead to a state where no rules, freedom, whatever you want. Somebody who finds themselves in a situation where the reins need to be tightened, even if they're of a chesed personality, they have to lean on gevura in order to rein things back in order to tighten things up a little bit. So for example, Abraham, our patriarch Abraham, is the archetype of chesed, of the right side. In fact, it says, our sages tell us in a beautiful passage that the angel of kindness turned to God during Abraham's lifetime and said, I don't have a job anymore. All the kindness is being done by Abraham. Abraham is such a kind and generous human being. All the kindness in the world, it's emanating from this guy. I don't have a job. That's kind of a way to bring out, to evoke the fact that he was very loving. Abraham is Abraham, not because he believed in God, not because of monotheism. Don't tell anybody I told you this, but that's not why he's Abraham. There were other people who knew about God. Noah knew about God. A fellow named Shem knew about God, a grandson of Noah, a son of Noah, Aver, a grandson of that family. They all knew about God, and there was a yeshiva. Shem and Aver had a yeshiva in which they taught Torah, or its original incarnation of Torah. They taught these things about God. So what's with Abraham? Abraham is Abraham, and Abraham is the first Jew because He wasn't satisfied with what he believed in or with what he knew. He was driven to teach others. He was driven to share it with others, and he did it with love. Famously, he and his wife Sarah, they had a tent, and their tent was open on all sides, and they welcomed all passers-by in. And what did they do? They fed them. It's like a Chabad house. They fed them. They gave them good, well, when it's not virtual, they fed them with good food. And then when the person said, well, thank you, that's amazing food in the middle of a desert, they said, don't thank us, thank God. And the person said, who's God? He said, let me tell you about it. Everyone else is wrong. All right, that's it. There are people who believe that they have the truth and everyone else is wrong, and are very bitter about it, and have angry websites and blogs. Everyone else is wrong. The world is very angry people. Abraham and Sarah, they believed in something radical, but they love people. So they said, hey, we found this thing. We discovered this truth. Come on in. Let's tell you about it with love. When Abraham was told by God to bring up his son as an offering, our sages tell us that was the greatest test of Abraham's life. Why? Because Abraham was a lover of people. And now God was telling him, he didn't say sacrifice, bring up your son as an offering, which he understood to be a sacrifice. Taking the life, God forbid, taking the life of his son, that's how he understood it. And that was the test. Would he be willing to go through it with what he understood it to be? And he said yes, he was willing to go through it. That is totally 180 degrees against his personality. His personality is love. It's helping the other, not harming the other. So when God tells him to bring the son up as an offering, and he says, okay, it's what God wants, that's the greatest test. And again, it didn't happen. There was no sacrifice. There's never meant to be a sacrifice, and we don't believe in human sacrifices, like I mentioned a day or two ago in this very setting. But the key idea here is, getting back to the split hooves, Abraham was predominantly the right side. But when needed, he was able to lean on the left side as well, the other hoof, or the other half of the hoof. And the same thing is true in our lives. If you're more chesed, you have to know when to use gvura. If you're more gvura, you have to know when to have chesed. If you find yourself more of the disciplinarian, like when you see, they're not even paying attention to the content, the first thing they know is they're proofreading. By the way, that's fantastic, because the world needs proofreaders. So it's I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's a good thing. But if a person finds themselves, it's not about judging anybody else. If a person themselves feels, you know what, I'm let's say with parenting, the whole day I'm like wearing a police hat. The whole day don't do this, do that. Genuksha. What am I? That's who I am as a parent. Rules, you need to love, and they're not mutually exclusive. You could love with rules and rule with love, whatever. Not rule with love, rules with love. Bottom line is you need both. You need balance. So the split hooves is an animal that's kosher. If you want to imbibe something, you want to digest something that has both, and it's a message for us how to live. The animal teaches us what it means to be a mensch. The same thing with chewing cud. What does it mean to chew its cud? So without getting into the physical biology of it, the way it works is, without getting into it, as I proceed to get into it slightly, so what happens is the animal chews the food and it goes into the stomach, and there are multiple stomachs in a cow. I think there's 4 or 5 different stomachs that a cow has, and it basically moves from one stomach back to the other stomach to another stomach, and it goes through until it's fully digested. And the idea here is that a healthy human being, or a menschy human being, even better, a menschy human being is someone who chews their cud. Someone who deliberates before responding. Someone who chews things over before reacting. Someone who doesn't act on impulse. You offend them, let's go to war. You make them happy, everything's amazing. That is the mark of, I don't want to say anything like negative or derogatory, but that's a lack of maturity. A lack of maturity is a very emotional and reactive way of being. You tell a child says, can I have ice cream? No. And the child loses it. Okay? So what? Because of the ice cream? No, that's it. World's over, finished. Right? Or you give the child something that they want. The best. It's like the best thing that ever happened. As an adult, you realize the ice cream is not the worst thing not to have, and the toy is not the best thing that ever happened. You're able to we have two eyes. That gives us a little perspective. It's good, but it's not the best. It's not so good. It's not the worst. By the way, it's easy to talk about children, but we also have the same reaction in our own lives. And the message of the chewing the cud sign for a kosher animal is we should have the ability and we should exercise the power of chewing things over before reacting. Not just reacting emotionally, not just like a gut reaction, an instant reaction. Today it's all about instant reactions, right? It's all about, what's the first reaction, the first take, hot take. Look, maybe it sells, it gets hits on websites and maybe it's popular. Doesn't matter what's popular. It doesn't really matter what's popular because we're talking about Jewish values. And in Jewish values, what's right is being mindful. It's about digesting, processing before we react. There's a really powerful story that's told in one of the good Jewish books. It's actually told as a true story. Either way, there's a powerful message. Story about a fellow who left his family. He had to go for work, or he had to go to war. It was whatever. There's a draft. Create your own scenario. The husband, father, has to leave, and it goes longer than he expected. Maybe he got lost. Maybe there was a shipwreck. Create your own scenario. This is like a DIY story. I don't remember the exact details. Anyway, he comes back home after 20 years. And he's so excited to see his wife. And as he approaches the house, he sees another man. And he sees his wife in close contact with this other man. And they're hugging. And he gets so incensed. My wife with another man. He's about to burst in and just, and beat up this guy and ask questions later. And then he remembers, let me ask some questions first. Let me find out the story before I react. He comes in and he smiles. He says, I'm back. And his wife sees him and the other guy is there. And she said, the wife starts crying, welcome home. And then she says, this is our son. Remember him as a little kid? That's how the story ends. So what's the moral of the story? We all feel reactions. You can't stop how you feel. I mean, you could try, but it's probably not going to work. The instant reaction is somehow, wired that way, for better or for worse. We all react inside a way. But the question is, past the instant reaction, right? What do you say? What do you do? How do you be? I know that's not correct English, but how are we? How do we act? And that's meant to be mindful. So those are the two signs. That's the sign of chewing the cud. Chewing the cud means you think things over, you analyze, you digest, you make sense of it, and then you make a decision, then you make a reaction. You don't react right away. You react based on regurgitating, thinking about it a little bit. Maybe not regurgitating, thinking about it, mulling it over, chewing it over, processing it, and then react. So, to be a mensch, to be a kosher human being, is like to be a kosher animal. You have to have split hooves, both right and left. Balance. Don't only be the one side, also have the other side. That's healthy. And not so reactive. Does that make sense? Okay. By the way, there are many more symbolisms. Those are the two that that resonate with me and that I love and I always think about when I think about kosher food. So that's what I wanted to share. Now, what about fish? The signs of a kosher fish are fins and scales. So what's the deal with the fins and scales? Everyone wants to know. What's the deal with the fins and scales? The Talmud says something interesting. The Talmud says any animal that has scales will have fins. Sorry, any fish, not animal. Try that again. Any fish that has scales will always have fins. Like study fish, right? Google fish, and you'll find that all fish that have scales also have fins. But not every fish that has a fin has scales. So you could have fin fish without scales, but if you have scales, you will have fins. So the question that the commentators ask is, well, if that's the case, if it always comes in a package deal with scales, you always have fins, so why didn't the Torah just give one sign of a kosher fish? Are you with me? Why didn't the Torah just say that what's the sign of a kosher fish? Scales. And with scales you'll have fins, but why mention it? Why specify it? So the Talmud says the reason is lahagdil Torah ladira. The reason why the Torah gave two signs is to give more details in Torah, to expand Torah. If Torah was so brief, if Torah was so concise, we would have a few extra words in Torah, a few less words in Torah. So the Torah, in order to give us a little bit more to chew on, maybe literally or figuratively, so we have two signs instead of one. But it happens to be, in reality, in the world we live in, if it has scales, it will have fins, but those are still the two kosher signs. Okay, so let's understand what they mean, and let's understand this Talmudic passage a little bit deeper. So what are fins, what are scales? They each have different roles. The role of fins are symbolic of ambition and drive and moving forward. Are you with me? Fins equals ambition. Let's talk about scales. What are scales? Scales are like armor for the fish. If you look at scales, it looks kind of like armor, like a scaled armor. Scales are all about protection, are all about protecting the integrity of the fish. So the fins and the scales have two different roles. The fins move the fish forward, and the scales protect the fish against, errant algae or whatever it is. Look, I'm not a fish expert, so I could be making that last point up. But it's a form of armor around the fish to protect the fish against something outside. So again, the two values are ambition and integrity. Ambition fins, integrity scales. So I'll ask you a question. Which quality is more important in life? Ambition or integrity? Which one is most important? Ambition or integrity?
Integrity in the Jewish faith.
But what are we taught in the world, right? What are kids taught in school or whatever? I don't mean Jewish school. I mean in the Welt. What does the world talk about? Ambition, success. In fact, the whole schooling system in the world, in our culture at large, right? Not specifically Jewish, but general culture, is all about getting kids in the right school, the right preschool, so that they can get into the right kindergarten, so they can get in the right elementary school, middle school, high school, college, to get the right job, to earn enough money, or to earn the right amount of money, and then to climb the corporate ladder until you become the CEO of the world, and then really, really, really make it. Which means, and kids know this, it's not like kids are unaware of what the parents are thinking. I mean, this is what parents think. And the kids know this. Right? Because you tell them you have to do well in school. Why? Because what about your job? What about your future? So what's the message? As the Rebbe once said, what's the message? Do well at all costs. Right? And that's why you have scenarios, not all kids, but scenarios where children in school will put ambition, right? Academic ambition before integrity. Hence cheating on tests, etc. And it's not just true with the children on it. Because they get funding based on test scores, and they put their ambition, right, in front of integrity. So when I ask the question, which is a better value, which is a greater value, integrity or ambition? So, Donna, you're right. Integrity. Of course, 100%, every day of the week. Every day in the Jewish understanding. But the question is, which value is actually celebrated in the world? Not which one would people write when they're being asked a moral question and they feel, they feel like they should give the right answer. But which is the realistic answer? Which is the real answer? Most of the time, honestly, ambition is put before integrity. And that's why the Talmud says, you can have a fish that has fins, but no scales, and guess what? It's not a kosher fish. A human being could have all the ambition in the world, not tons, but a huge fin, and moving forward with tremendous speed and velocity, climbing that corporate river, whatever, right? Accelerating with an incredible rate of success, but it's not kosher if there's no scales. Now, you could have both, but if you just have fins and no scales, it's not kosher. But the Talmud says every fish that has scales also has fins, which means that if you have integrity, ultimately part of that integrity will also lead to the ambition to share that, to spread that with others, and that will lead to both the integrity and the success that you're looking for, but kosher success. And thus, that's the definition of a kosher fish, and that's the explanation of the Talmud. The Talmud says that if it has fins, there's no indication that it's kosher yet. You have to look for the scales. People are very successful, but who knows how many people they stepped on and destroyed on the way up there. I'm not saying they did necessarily, but it could be. And we know stories, right? We know some of the most celebrated successful business people. We know their corporate behavior, right? We know. Listen, I'm not going to mention, even somebody like Steve Jobs, right? Who is he did amazing things. At the same time, it's clear that it wasn't easy to work for him, right? And it's also clear that maybe some people were hurt along the way. Now, does that mean that you should... Look, I know I gave a specific example, and I'm going to try to work my way out of it, because it's really not about anybody specifically. It's about a concept that we can all apply in our own lives. But I just got carried away with a specific example. So let me just move back to the concept. The concept is a kosher fish, and you and I are meant to be that kosher fish, right? We are what we eat. A kosher fish, fins and scales, ambition and integrity. If you just have ambition without integrity, no good. If you just have integrity without ambition, not great. But the Talmud says there's a promise out there. If you have the scales, ultimately you will have the fins. So let's work on the integrity. The ambition will follow. Which means that when we're educating kids, what's the first message? Integrity. And then it's about the academics. First thing is right and wrong, integrity, morals and values. Are those taught in schools? I don't know. I think the skills are taught in school. When I say skills, I mean the academic stuff is taught in school. Schools focus on that. And the reason is for the success. And the Jewish take would be a little bit different. So that's a little bit about fins and scales and kosher. And then yesterday we spoke about birds, third category, animals, fish, and birds. And I mentioned this very quickly, that the non-kosher birds are birds of prey. And the idea is when we see somebody vulnerable, that's not a sign to attack. That might be a trait of the birds of prey, but we're not supposed to eat birds of prey. We're not supposed to inculcate. We're not supposed to absorb and assimilate that type of behavior. We're meant to be kind and generous to the other, specifically to the one that is in a vulnerable state. You know, I know I'm focusing on kids in school, but bullying in school, right? Who gets bullied in school? Who's on the receiving end of getting bullied? Typically, the kid or the kids that the other kids perceive to be a little bit more vulnerable. So when you see a little vulnerability, that's when typically there's an attack. And Torah tells us that is anti-Jewish. That's against Torah. That's not kosher. It's not kosher behavior. We would never eat such a bird. We should never behave in such a way. On the contrary, when you see somebody who's a little bit more vulnerable, that's a sign not to attack, but to... And again, it's not kosher. I mean, of course, that's abhorrent and that's immoral, illegal, and just off the rails. But even in subtle senses, even in a subtle sense, the message is that we are meant to take care of each other and not in any way harm each other. All right.